Good to see all of you again. We are going to pick up where we left off last time at the end of the administration, the second term of Andrew Jackson. Today we'll be examining the presidency of Martin Van Buren, the very brief presidency of William Henry Harrison, the presidency of John Tyler, as well as the presidency of James K. Polk and the Mexican War. So Andrew Jackson was an incredibly influential president. He was responsible for the destruction of the Second National Bank of the United States. He was responsible for the creation of the Democratic Party, championing that party as the common man versus the powerful and the elite. He was responsible for preserving the Union over the course of the nullification crisis and consequently destroying the doctrine of nullification. Along the way, he was responsible for removing the civilized Indian tribes from the southeastern United States across the Mississippi into what is today modern Oklahoma. And he was, of course, a very popular president as well, but he was not popular with everyone. The members of the former Federalist Party, which had been destroyed during the War of 1812 as a consequence of the Hartford Convention, did not like Andrew Jackson. There were Democrats who did not like Andrew Jackson. They thought that he was arrogant. They thought he was unsophisticated. Primarily, they argued that he had concentrated too much power in the hands of the presidency, and that made them very, very nervous, very unhappy. Of course, members of the old National Republican Party of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay didn't care much for Andrew Jackson either. And during his second term, these forces gathered together to create a new political party, and that political party was called the Whig Party. The Whig Party. And it's named after a British political party that usually stood in opposition to the will of the king and the king's party in the parliament. And since they felt that Jackson had taken unto himself extraordinary powers, and they were fond of referring to him as King Andrew, then referring to themselves as the Whigs made perfect sense. Unfortunately for the Whigs, they don't come into existence until Andrew Jackson is pretty much on his way off the stage. Jackson, remember, could have run for a third term as president. There's no constitutional prohibition against that until after World War II when you get the 22nd Amendment. But George Washington had established the precedent that 2 terms was it. And who was Andrew Jackson to say that he deserved more time as the country's chief executive than George Washington had? So Jackson is going to step from the stage in 1836, which means that the American people are going to have to choose a new president without an incumbent in office. Now, what the country really wanted in 1836 was 4 more years of Old Hickory, as Jackson was nicknamed. But since that wasn't an option, they leaned towards supporting his hand-picked successor, which was his former Secretary of State and Ambassador to Great Britain, Martin Van Buren. Remember, Martin Van Buren was the only member of the cabinet who had been nice to Peggy Eaton during that kerfuffle in Jackson's first term. That was in part because he was a bachelor and made it easy for him. But now he's going to be repaid for his loyalty by being the man that Jackson tells the country should replace him as President of the United States. He will be opposed by the Whigs, but the Whigs, being a brand new party and a party that doesn't have a lot of internal cohesion, it doesn't have an overarching philosophy beyond we don't like Andrew Jackson. Personally, we do not like Andrew Jackson. We oppose everything Andrew Jackson stands for. The Whigs could not settle on a single candidate. And so instead of nominating 1, they nominated 3. Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, William Henry Harrison from Ohio, and Hugh Lawson from Tennessee. And of course, what they were hoping for was to so divide the electoral vote that there would be no clear winner and the election would be tossed into the House of Representatives where they might be able to prevail. Of course, this didn't happen. What the Whigs really succeeded in doing was splitting their vote in 3 different ways, and that allowed Martin Van Buren to win 15 of 26 states, 170 electoral votes compared to the combined total for the Whigs of 113. So Martin Van Buren is yet another former Secretary of State who goes on to be the president. And he comes into office in the midst of a really unlucky set of circumstances. So he's elected in November of 1836. He's going to take office, he's going to be inaugurated in March of 1837, and just a couple of weeks before he's sworn in, a financial panic hits the country. The stock market crashes, and it sets off a depression known as the Panic of 1837. Cotton prices plummeted by 50%. Banks failed, and remember, if the banks go down, there is no recourse for depositors. Their money is simply gone. This was a really serious economic downturn, and it basically destroys Van Buren's presidency before it even really gets started. The dominant economic attitude of all political parties during this period in history was laissez-faire economics. And basically that's a French phrase that means, keep your hands off the economy. Do as little with the economy as you can, because economies run on a cycle. This was a very easy thing for Americans to believe. We were a nation of farmers by and large. And for farmers, they live by the cycle of the seasons. In fact, if you look at life is governed by cycles: spring, summer, winter, fall, spring, summer, winter, fall. Plow, plant, grow, harvest. Plow, plant, grow, harvest. You're born, you're a toddler, you're a child, you're an adolescent, you're an adult, you're old, you die. These cycles are natural. And if you believe that economies work like everything else in nature, then messing with the duration of any particular phase of a cycle could be cataclysmic. So, the old axiom here that what goes up must come down, what hits the ground inevitably bounces up. Sooner or later, the good times will return, and they're more apt to do that if you do not meddle with the natural order. And so laissez-faire economics, do nothing. The difficulty with that, of course, for Van Buren and the Democrats is that they have a political opposition. And although the political opposition, the Whig Party, embrace the same kind of economic philosophy, they don't have to deal with the Panic of 1837, but they can run around and blame the Panic of 1837 on Van Buren and the Democratic Party and the policies of Andrew Jackson that Van Buren had inhabited. And Van Buren didn't have an answer for that. He was unwilling to do anything proactively to try and deal with this economic downturn, and as a consequence, he got painted as being ineffective. And it does not hurt, of course, that he has the same problem that John Adams had following in the footsteps of George Washington, and that was that he is not a war hero. He's not a tall, imposing, heroic figure like Andrew Jackson had been, like George Washington had been. And as a consequence of that, it was almost impossible for Martin Van Buren to live up to expectations. When the country really wanted 4 more years of Andrew Jackson, who was the physical and spiritual antithesis of Martin Van Buren, they're obviously predisposed to be disappointed, and disappointed they were, and as a consequence of that, when the election of 1840 rolled around, although Van Buren is renominated, he is a badly wounded incumbent, and by this time the Whigs have learned their lesson. They're not going to nominate 3 candidates, they're going to nominate 1. The question, of course, is which one to nominate. And this really wasn't that difficult for them to do because of the 3 men that had run on the Whig ticket in 1836. The one who had gained the most votes was William Henry Harrison of Ohio. And therefore Harrison was the logical standard bearer, but he was more than that, because what the Whigs basically asked themselves is, what do the American people want? Who are the American people going to vote for? And the Whigs were self-aware enough to realize that what the American people really wanted was Andrew Jackson. So the best candidate would be someone who mimicked in many ways Andrew Jackson, at least in every way except policy. And in this regard, William Henry Harrison fit the bill. He was a Westerner from Ohio. Jackson, remember, was a Westerner from Tennessee. He had spent most of his life in the military. He was a war hero, victor of the Battle of Tippecanoe at the dawn of the War of 1812. He was rough and tumble. He, in fact, actually looked like Andrew Jackson. Photography has been invented by this point, and we have pictures of an aged William Henry Harrison and an aged Andrew Jackson, and the two men could readily be brothers. And so if you were looking for a clone of Jackson to run on the Whig ticket, William Henry Harrison was perfect. Of course, being a Midwesterner from Ohio, it was considered important to nominate as a vice president a Southerner, somebody who might attract traditional Democratic votes, and the Whigs decided upon John Tyler of Virginia, who was, philosophically speaking, a very true blue Democrat, but he was one of those Democrats who personally had found Andrew Jackson appalling and had therefore joined the Whigs. The Whigs, of course, wanted to emphasize Harrison's personality. Basically, the campaign of 1840 is going to be one that is going to focus on personalities. It's not going to really be concerned with great issues. The Whigs are essentially saying, hey, the Democrats and Martin Van Buren are responsible for the Depression, and so they need to be thrown out of office. And we've got the next coming of Andrew Jackson to replace the failed Martin Van Buren. Of course, one of the problems with William Henry Harrison is that his military glory is a long time ago. The Battle of Tippecanoe had been fought in November of 1811. Now we're in 1840, and so to remind voters of Harrison's distant military glory, and to liken him again to Andrew Jackson, who had a nickname Old Hickory, the Whigs decided that William Henry Harrison must have a nickname. They called him Old Tippecanoe. Old Tippecanoe. And the campaign slogan of the Whigs in 1840 was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And it was incredibly effective. And this is one of the first campaigns where you see a lot of the trappings of modern politics. The hats, the banners, the slogans, the songs, the buttons, all this sort of stuff. And it worked out. It worked out wonderfully for William Henry Harrison, who goes on to win the presidency in 1840. He got 234 electoral votes compared to Martin Van Buren's 60 electoral votes. And the Whigs also managed to capture control of both houses of the Congress. So this is pretty remarkable. Here you have a party that's been in existence for only about 5 years, and it has won the presidency, and it has won control of the Congress. Of course, it's done that to a certain extent by selling its soul and nominating an Andrew Jackson clone as its presidential candidate, but victory is victory. And it made the old General William Henry Harrison the new president of the United States. And at the time, he was the oldest man ever to be elected to that office. He was 67. That record has long since been surpassed, but 67 was a great deal older in 1840 than it is in the modern era. And William Henry Harrison, therefore, is the oldest man to become president. He's the first Whig to become president, and he's got to get in the record books in a couple of other ways that are not necessarily positive. He took the oath of office in March of 1841 on a cold, blustery, rainy, windy day. The weather was absolutely miserable. And as was custom, when someone stood up to give a speech, Harrison took off his hat, and so all of that rain came down on his elderly head. He spoke for an hour and 40 minutes. An hour and 40 minutes, which means he gave the longest inaugural address in presidential history. No one before had ever spoken that long. No one since has ever spoken that long. In all likelihood, this record is going to stand forever. And that long talk and that driving cold rain was ill-advised because President Harrison caught a cold. The cold morphed into pneumonia, and 30 days later, he was dead. So William Henry Harrison gets in the record books in another way. He's the first president to die in office. And you can do the math. If his inaugural address is an hour and 40 minutes long, it means that it consumes about 11% of his entire presidency. So Harrison is dead, and that means that for the first time ever, the elected vice president has to assume the duties of the chief executive, and that vice president was, of course, John Tyler. John Tyler, who is really more of a Democrat, politically speaking, than he is a Whig. He's in the Whig Party simply because he personally doesn't like Andrew Jackson, and he's going to have almost an entire presidential term to serve out, and it is not going to go well. The country had never experienced this before, and remember that vice presidents were not selected on the basis that they would be suitable to become president if something should happen to the chief executive. They were selected to balance the ticket, to attract a certain class of voters from a certain region of the country. And having done that, they were, for all intents and purposes, supposed to disappear from the political landscape. You haven't had a vice president go on to be the chief executive since Thomas Jefferson. Nobody thought of it that way. And nobody knew what was going to happen if a vice president stepped up and became the guy in charge. Was he really going to try and be president in fact as well as in name? Was he just going to be a figurehead? Was he going to let the leaders of the party in Congress pull the strings? And John Tyler, of course, was determined to be president in fact, not just in name. He was not going to be a figurehead, and he intended to truly govern. And that meant he ran afoul of Henry Clay, who was really the intellectual leader of the Whig Party, who had no love for John Tyler and really did intend to be pulling the strings. He wanted to be the power behind the throne. Tyler was not going to let that happen, and so Clay and Tyler clashed, and basically what this leads to is Tyler being thrown out of the Whig Party. The Whigs don't want anything to do with him. So the poor Whigs, they finally win the presidency, but their guy dies a month in, and as a consequence of that, they basically lose the presidency after 30 days because they want nothing to do with the incumbent. The Democrats, of course, will not take John Tyler back. He bolted their party. He's joined the enemy. And so you have a president for 4 years who belongs to neither political party. And of course, that's a recipe for not very much getting done. And in fact, very little of importance gets done during John Tyler's presidency. And for Tyler, this was a bitter disappointment because he believed he could be a really good president if he was just given the chance. And he was determined to prove the point. He was not going to quietly slink from the stage in 1844. He intended to run for and be elected to the presidency in his own right, not just fulfilling the term of the dead Henry Harrison, but becoming President John Tyler with his own 4-year term to play out. Of course, this is going to be difficult to do if neither political party wants anything to do with you. Neither one's going to nominate you. Neither one's going to campaign for you. Neither one's going to raise money for you. So how exactly does Tyler expect to continue as president of the United States? Get elected in his own right in 1844. Well, what he decides to do is to grasp an issue that is so popular with the American people that by becoming the champion of that issue, he will be swept into office by popular mandate, and that having happened, the two political parties will have no recourse but to deal with him. And what was the issue that Tyler intended to grab hold of? And that issue was something called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. Now, this is a very old concept, if we want to be honest about it, but one that had earned a name only in 1840 when a magazine writer named Timothy O'Sullivan coined the phrase manifest destiny. And manifest destiny means the obvious, God-ordained destiny, future of the United States to expand all the way to the Pacific coast and perhaps over the entire Western hemisphere. This idea that it was necessary, that it was obvious, that it was the will of God that the United States become a continental and maybe a hemispheric power was backed up by the belief that the country had to expand in order to find land for people to live on. The population was growing by leaps and bounds. Americans were making lots of babies. You had waves of immigrants coming in from places like Ireland and later Germany. And where were all these people going to live? The Industrial Revolution, remember, is just really getting going. So most people are still farmers. Farmers need land. We're going to fill up the land that we have. We're going to need additional land for all these new farm families to live on. And so this is Manifest Destiny is something that is demographically necessary. It's economically necessary because people believe that a lot of our prosperity stemmed from our physical growth as a country, new land, new resources, new markets, new opportunities, and this sort of thing. And one way or another, Americans, even before they were Americans, had always embraced Manifest Destiny. In a way, English colonization is a form of British Manifest Destiny, right? After the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the British believed that they were God's chosen people, that God intended great things for them, and to be great, they would need colonies on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and so you ultimately got Roanoke and Jamestown and Plymouth and Massachusetts and so on and so forth. And from the moment the first English colonists had set foot on American soil, they had been relentlessly pushing westward. And that had continued through the Revolutionary War, had picked up enormous speed after the Revolutionary War, now under the auspices of the United States. And so when you talk about Manifest Destiny, you are striking a deep chord in the American psyche, a deep chord in American memory. And so the idea here is pretty solid. But if you're going to embrace Manifest Destiny, you're going to make it the center of your bid to remain president of the United States in the election of 1844, how, practically speaking, do you fulfill Manifest Destiny? Where is the country going to expand? And remember, courtesy of the Adams-O'Neill Treaty, under the presidency of James Monroe, the United States has already acquired Florida and the entire Gulf Coast of what is now the U.S. east of the Mississippi River. The Adams-O'Neill Treaty had drawn the line between Louisiana Purchase and the Spanish Southwest, and that line had taken it all the way to the Pacific coast at the southern border of modern-day Oregon. And that meant that the only places that the United States could truly expand into were in the southwestern portion of North America, into what was now Mexico. Remember, Mexico had won its independence shortly after the Adams-O'Neill Treaty was signed, and so if you're going to practice Manifest Destiny, going to preach Manifest Destiny, if you're going to run an election campaign on the basis of Manifest Destiny, then you're talking about Texas. And as it turns out, Texas was ripe for American Manifest Destiny. So we sort of turn the page for a moment and we begin to talk about a little Texas history. So Mexico wins its independence. All of the former viceroyalty of New Spain becomes part of the new Mexican Republic. Mexico is going to be set with all kinds of difficulties, and one of the primary ones is a struggle in Mexico over what kind of government the new country is going to have. And basically this boils down to a fight between centralist and federalist. And the centralists were those who wanted to concentrate all power in the capital, Mexico City. It would make all the laws, it would make all the decisions, it would have all of the control, and the states of Mexico would be basically administrative components of the national government. There would be no real state sovereignty to speak of. The Federalists wanted a system more like that of the United States, where the central government is given certain specific jobs and certain specific powers, diplomacy, war, regulating interstate commerce, delivering the mail, these kinds of things, and then the states are left to deal with everything else. We're having local control, real sovereignty, the power to make real decisions that impact people's daily lives. And this struggle between centralists and federalists would wax and wane. It would involve war and revolution and civil war in Mexico for decades to come. But Mexico had bigger problems in a way than this. And those problems stemmed along its northern frontier, which included Texas. Remember that we're talking here, Mexico owns Texas, what is today Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California. But Texas was the real troublemaker because of the Comanche Indians who lived in Texas. So the Comanche were a highly mobile civilization whose principal economic activity revolved around raiding. In fact, the word Comanche is an Indian word that means the enemy. So even other Indian tribes in Texas, like the Kiowa, for example, didn't like the Comanche, warred against the Comanche. And what the Comanche would do every year is they would stage these long mounted raids out of what today is northwest Texas. They'd sweep down through central Texas and into northern Mexico, stealing horses, stealing livestock, taking captives, slaughtering and destroying and creating a giant swath of destruction. And this was a problem that Mexico was desperate to solve. And of course, the best way to protect Mexico below the Rio Grande was to put lots of people north of there, to put people in Texas who would be able to meet and turn back these Comanche raids. There were some settlements in Texas at places like San Antonio and Goliad and Natchitoches way over on the Sabine River next to Louisiana. But there weren't a lot of Mexicans who lived there, and it was very hard to get other Mexicans to move there because obviously they knew that going north of the Rio Grande was going into, in essence, a war zone. They were putting themselves and their families out there at the mercy of the Comanche. And so the Mexican government looked with favor when an American by the name of Moses Austin showed up and advocated moving Americans as colonists into Texas. Now, Austin, in fact, began these talks when Mexico was still part of Spain. He got an agreement with the viceroyalty, the viceroy of Spain, and then he goes back to Missouri to sort of start the effort. But two things happen in the interim. Mexico gets its independence, and Moses Austin dies, which throws the whole operation sort of into question. But his son, Stephen F. Austin, had promised his father that he would carry through with his vision. He goes back to Mexico City, talks to the new government of Mexico, secures the same agreement. So the Mexican government is going to allow American citizens, Anglos, to move into Texas. It's going to grant them land, and so long as they learn Spanish, they convert to Catholicism, and they swear loyalty to the Mexican government, they will be allowed to settle. They will become Mexican citizens. And the promise of lots of land for free in exchange for these conditions made it very easy for Austin to recruit settlers. He came in and settled in basic what today is southeast central Texas and prospered. And where Austin succeeded, others were willing to follow. More settlers came in. They put down roots. They fought Comanche. They at least in theory, converted to Catholicism. Some of them learned Spanish. They formed militia units and swore allegiance to Mexico, and they did extremely well. And to some extent, this succeeded in accomplishing Mexico's goal of creating a population buffer between Mexico below the Rio Grande and the Comanche. Now, it didn't completely succeed. The Comanche could skirt these new settlements and still get into the northern Mexico, but you could see where this was going. The problem was that over time, more and more Americans came in, and when the Mexican government got around to really looking into this, it realized that the loyalty that these Anglos held toward Mexico was pretty tentative. A general sent to inspect Texas came back to Mexico, and he said they have sworn allegiance to Mexico. They are learning the language. Some of them who converted to Catholicism, but in their hearts and in their souls, they're really still Americans. And these Americans carry their Constitution around with them in their pocket, meaning that even though they were Mexican subjects, they still believed that they had all the rights and privileges that the United States Constitution, the United States Bill of Rights, had guaranteed American citizens. And that didn't necessarily translate cleanly into the rights that Mexico was willing to grant its citizens. Over time, the relationship between the Americans in Texas, who called themselves Tejanos, or Texicans, Texicans being the much more common phrase, that relationship soured, and ultimately the Texicans got caught up in the perpetual civil strife in Mexico between Centralist and Federalist. The Texicans favored the Federalist cause. Of course they did. And they were very frustrated by the fact that Texas was not given statehood within the Mexican Republic. Although Texas was a very long way from Mexico City, it was essentially brigaded with Matamoros, and that meant that a Texan had to travel vast distances, dangerous, difficult journey to do any kind of official business. So this was bad. This was bad in terms of administration. It was bad in terms of economics. It was bad in terms of politics. And when the Federalist government that had been established and had written a Federalist Constitution in 1824 was overthrown and replaced by a centralist government under the leadership of Antonio de Lopez de Santa Anna, the Texicans had basically had enough. And led by men like William Barrett Travis, they had begun to protest against Mexican taxes and the often arbitrary and unfair in implementation of those taxes. That had led Santa Anna to send a warship to Anahuac to try and cow the Texicans into obedience. That had provoked a naval clash off the Texas coast, and that naval clash was the beginning of a Texas revolution, and eventually things spiraled out of control, and the Mexican army in San Antonio received orders to begin to disarm where it could Texian citizens. This led to a clash in October of 1835 at Gonzales, and the Mexicans sent cavalry to try and repossess a small cannon that had been lent to the citizens of Gonzales as a defense against the Comanche. The Texicans refused to give the cannon back to Mexico, and led to a small clash of arms during which the Texans flew a flag with the silhouette of a cannon and the famous words, "Come and take it," on it. The Mexicans were forced to retreat, at which point Stephen F. Austin formed an army of militia, and they marched against the biggest Mexican city in Texas and the home of the Mexican army in Texas, and that was the city of San Antonio. And for a while there was sort of a stalemate, but in early December of 1835, under the leadership of Ben Milam, the Texicans attacked the Mexican army under General Cos in San Antonio, and after 3 days of house-to-house fighting, defeated it and forced its surrender. The Mexicans were disarmed and allowed to march home, and the Texans had won for themselves an early initial victory. Of course, it was a victory that was on unfirm ground. At this point, what the Texans are fighting for is statehood within Mexico, but General Santa Anna's reaction to this Texas rebellion is going to swing the Anglos in Texas and their Tejano allies in a completely different direction. So the Texans began to argue and debate with themselves, what are we doing? A lot of the militiamen went home for the winter, believing that there was no threat from Mexico until spring. Nobody was going to march an army across northern Mexico and South Texas at that time of year. There was too little forage in the fields to eat. The weather was too bad. And so the Texas defenses shrank. Even as the Texicans were making appeals in the United States for recruits, money, arms, and weapons, one of the leading Texans, Sam Houston, a former governor and congressman from Tennessee, was put in charge of raising an army, but he did not get along with the provisional government of Texas. They differed on strategy. What Houston wanted to do was defend Texas east of San Antonio. He did not believe in a forward defense. He said we need to look to the coast to prevent an amphibious landing, and we need to basically defend the line of the Colorado River, which is a good line of defense. It gives us a physical barrier that the Mexicans would have great difficulty in crossing, good defensive terrain, but the government disagreed with him, and it disagreed with him particularly over the issue of San Antonio, where there was a small Texican force under the dual command of William Barrett Travis and James Bowie, and they had roughly 150 men and a huge stockpile of artillery that had been left behind by the Mexicans, stockpiled at an old broken down mission outside of town known as the Alamo. And Houston believed that the Alamo was too far west to be adequately defended. It was a position that could be easily surrounded and cut off and its garrison destroyed. So he wanted Travis and Bowie to destroy the Alamo and pull back to the Colorado. But since San Antonio was the biggest city in Texas, a lot of Texican political leaders believed that there was no way you could abandon San Antonio, that you had to defend Texas as far west as possible to protect the Texas colonists and their homesteads. And so, in disgust, Sam Houston resigned command of the army and went to negotiate a treaty of neutrality with the Cherokee Indians, who lived in what is today northeastern Texas. And Houston did not get his wish that the Alamo be abandoned and destroyed. And that is unfortunate because General Santa Anna did the thing that nobody thought that he could do. And he staged a winter campaign. He marched an army across northern Mexico and southern Texas to appear on the outskirts of San Antonio at the end of February of 1836 and taking the Texans by surprise. Bowie and Travis, who had been joined by a famous Tennessee congressman and frontiersman, Davy Crockett, and 20-some men from Tennessee, were forced to flee into the Alamo, where they were laid under siege for 13 days. Another Mexican army, a smaller one, had marched along the coast and had crossed the Rio Grande near Matamoros, and it was moving toward the town of Goliad. And Goliad had the largest concentration of Texian troops, some 400 of them, under the command of a former West Pointer by the name of James Fannin. He was a colonel in the Texas service. He'd only been at West Point for a year before he'd left the academy, but that gave him more military training than most Texicans had, and so he got command at Goliad and actually did a pretty good job of training his troops. Goliad was important because holding Goliad protected the direct path into most of the Texas colonies and ports like, or port cities like Indianola and towns like Victoria. And that is why the Texans had concentrated most of their forces there. Unfortunately for the Texans, Sam Houston had been right. San Antonio, Goliad were too far west to be adequately defended. Santa Anna, after a 13-day siege, launched a dawn assault on the Alamo on March 6th, and in brutal combat overran the garrison, killing every man inside of it. It was a very gallant defense, bravely conducted, but it was militarily a disaster. Travis had asked for help from Fannin at Goliad, and Fannin had started in that direction, but then changed his mind, reconsidering his mission, which was to defend the heart of the Texas colonies. He decided to keep his army in Goliad, which militarily was not an unsound decision. Unfortunately, once the Alamo fell, Santa Anna was able to concentrate his army on Goliad, at which point Fannin understood that he was going to be surrounded and suffer the same fate as the Alamo, and so he abandoned the Presidio La Bahia at Goliad and retreated toward Victoria, and he didn't get away with it. The Mexicans caught up with him at the Battle of Coleto Creek. He was surrounded and eventually forced to surrender. His men were taken back to the Presidio, kept as prisoners of war for a couple weeks, and then upon Santa Anna's order, they were executed. Some of them, of course, survived to tell the tale, but the bulk of them were executed. And with the destruction of the Alamo in the fall of Goliad and the massacre of its defending army, including Colonel Fannin, the Texas colonies were now open to invasion. And so you got a weeks-long event known as the Runaway Scrape. So Sam Houston has come back in this disaster to try and reform a Texas army that is being reinforced by volunteer companies coming in from the United States, most of whom are coming by ship from New Orleans and coming into Galveston and similar ports. Supplies, munitions are coming from the United States the same way. There was a real danger that Mexico, having won these frontier victories, would now capitalize on them with an amphibious invasion of Texas, or they would bring up supplies and reinforcements to strengthen Santa Anna's army, which is now moving east from Goliad and San Antonio toward the Texas colonies. That didn't happen because one of the things that the Texans had done was to form a navy. It was a very small navy of 4 ships and some privateers, but the Mexican Navy was also very small. The Texas Navy was very active off the coast of Mexico, and what there was of the Mexican Navy was forced to defend its own shore, so Santa Anna is not going to be reinforced or resupplied by sea as he marches east toward the Sabine River, pursuing Sam Houston's army, which is trying to form and drill as it falls back toward the United States. The Texas citizens, whose government had declared independence on March 2nd, just before the fall of the Alamo, are fleeing with the Texican army, and they're practicing a scorched earth strategy. So they're carrying off everything they could, destroying what they have to leave behind. This means that Santa Anna has a hard time feeding his army. He has to sort of spread it out in pursuit. But that's no real worry because the Texicans are beaten. They're running for their lives, and the Mexican general knows it. They're trying to get to the United States where they can find sanctuary and, of course, hopefully provoke some sort of border incident that would give the American Republic an excuse to jump in on the war, something Santa Anna is determined that he's not going to give them. And so the Mexican army is in pursuit. It's supremely confident. Houston is falling back, but he's looking for an opportunity to turn and strike. And he finally finds it in the middle of April at a place called San Jacinto. So not very far away from the border with the United States. He turns and attacks a portion of the Mexican army, which has worn itself out in pursuit. It's gone into camp. In just 18 minutes of combat, the Texicans under Houston win the Battle of San Jacinto, crying as they attack, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." They overrun the Mexican line very quickly, and then taking revenge, they slaughter fleeing Mexicans for 20 or 30 minutes before the carnage stops. And among the prisoners taken at San Jacinto is General Santa Anna, who as a prisoner of war is compelled to sign the treaties of Velasco that grant Texas its independence and require the Mexican army, which is now, of course, very low on supplies and has gotten no reinforcements, to withdraw back into Mexico. And once that was done, Santa Anna was set free. He was allowed to go back to go to New York City, and from there back to Mexico, where, of course, he's fallen out of favor. And Texas has supposedly won its independence. So that's certainly what America thinks, and it's what the Texians think, but it's not what Mexico thinks. The Mexican government refuted the treaties of Velasco, saying properly that they were signed under duress and therefore are not binding. And as far as Mexico is concerned, Texas is a province in rebellion that Mexico intends eventually to get around to reconquer. And in the early 1840s, there are going to be all kinds of skirmishes, both on land and at sea, between the Republic of Texas and Mexico. Mexico is twice going to invade Texas, twice seize Goliad and San Antonio before withdrawing after a short period of time. The Texans are going to counter-invade Mexico. So it is independence without peace, and it is an independence that is recognized only by the United States and the Texans themselves. And that meant annexing Texas was kind of a dicey thing. Andrew Jackson had been president when the Texas Revolution broke out and won its success at San Jacinto. He had been willing to bring Texas into the Union. But before anything could happen, you had the Panic of 1837 break out. Martin Van Buren had enough troubles to deal with without risking a war with Mexico over annexing Texas, and so nothing had been done. And that meant that Texas was still sitting out there as an opportunity for John Tyler. There was a difficulty, though, a couple of difficulties, in pursuing manifest destiny in the direction of Texas. And one of those difficulties was, of course, annexing Texas could provoke war with Mexico. The other difficulty, and especially from the New England states, and especially for the Whigs, was that Texas was slave territory. Anglos moving to Texas had been allowed to take their slaves there. There were thousands of slaves in Texas, and Texas was huge, and the land that Texas claimed was far bigger than the state is even today. You might have seen some of the old maps that show Texas stretching over into part of what is today New Mexico and Arizona, and then snaking up into pieces of Colorado and Wyoming as well. So it was a vast amount of territory, almost as much land as what was left in the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630, and it was easy for Northerners and Whigs to imagine that if Texas was brought into the Union, it might be carved into 5, 6, 7 states, and those would all be slave states, and whatever the North had gained in the Missouri Compromise would be lost as a result. Another problem with doing this for the Whigs is that the radical abolitionists are Whigs. The Whigs are a party that stretches across the country, but its strength, its core, is the old Federalist territory in New England, and this is where the radical abolitionists are strongest, and they are unalterably opposed to any annexation that would add slave territory to the United States. So if John Tyler is going to use manifest destiny in order to secure the presidency in his own right, he's got to find a way to address that problem. Now, war with Mexico, you might be able to finesse. A lot of Americans were willing to have a war with Mexico to gain territory, but it was the slavery business. More than anything else, it was the slavery business that was the real obstacle to Tyler's ambition to use manifest destiny, annexation of Texas, as a way to stay in the White House. And here, Tyler had the good fortune of having a friend, a Mississippi senator named Walker, who came up with the solution to his difficulty. And what Walter did was to create something called the drain theory. And what the drain theory says is that, yes, if we annex Texas, it will expand slavery in the United States, but only temporarily. Only temporarily. In fact, Walker argues, annexing Texas is the surest way to get rid of slavery in the United States. And his argument was that slavery is based on cotton. Cotton wears out the soil. As the soil is exhausted, the cotton frontier moves west, always seeking new, fresh, fertile soil. It has gone into Texas, but it can only go so far into Texas because in about the middle of the Texas Republic, you run into something called the Balcones Escarpment, a sharp upward lift of the land, after which you have hill country that fades into desert. And so west of Austin, you're not going to grow cotton. The land is not suitable for it. The terrain is all wrong for cash crops. And what does that mean? It means that when the cotton frontier gets to the middle of Texas, it can't go any further west, so it's going to have to turn south toward the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. And as it goes south, it will drag slavery after it, and thus slavery will drain out of the eastern United States down through Texas into Mexico, and it will continue to pursue its path south for decades and decades to come, until we reach the point at some mythical day when we will no longer need slavery, but we can end slavery and free the slaves far away from the current America. And that means when the slaves are freed, they will be no trouble for people above the Rio Grande. And as Walker's drain theory puts it, quote, they can mingle with the other dark-skinned races of the planet and be lost to history forever, unquote. This is all rather fanciful, but it had the advantage of looking like it made sense if you glanced at a map. I mean, doesn't the southeastern tip of Texas sort of look like a drain out of the United States into Mexico and Central America? And it also has the advantage of kind of telling people something they want to hear. Everybody's in favor of manifest destiny. It's called manifest destiny for a reason. They just want to figure out how to do it without running into some of these objections. And the biggest objection is the spread of slave territory. And what Walker's drain theory, which is embraced by President Tyler, tells you is that there is a way to do it. That in fact, annexing Texas doesn't perpetuate slavery in the U.S. It will ultimately end slavery in the U.S. And with that, and the addition of some pretty astute diplomacy by Sam Houston, the idea of annexing Texas grows. What Houston is doing, he's in a fight in Texas with a political rival by the name of Marimu Lamar. And Lamar and the people following him want Texas to permanently remain a republic, and maybe one that stretches all the way to the Pacific. Houston and others want Texas to become part of the United States. Texas is broke. Texas is in pseudo-war with Mexico. Texas has tried to go and occupy Santa Fe, and that has failed. Texas cannot sustain itself economically. It can barely defend itself militarily, and so it's only logical that you become part of the American Republic because that's the safest thing to do. But if Texas looks too strong, then the case for annexation to the United States is much weaker. So what Houston is doing is busily portraying Texas as so weak and so bankrupt that it's going to have to do one of two things. It's either going to have to return to Mexico, or it's going to have to give itself to England. It's going to have to become part of the British Empire. And nothing could have been more abhorrent to most Americans than the idea of the British Empire reasserting itself below Canada into North America. And the Texans were engaged in trying to get a treaty of commerce with Great Britain. That meant that it was very easy to sort of sell the idea that maybe Texas was actually talking about joining the British Empire. And so you could make the argument now that not only is manifest destiny something that America needs to do and must do, is destined to do, it's also a way of keeping the British out of North America, and it's a way of ultimately getting rid of slavery in the United States. And with all of that, the momentum to annex Texas became so great that a treaty was actually drafted. It shows up in the Senate, and all you're waiting to do is have the debate and the vote. And it seems like a sure thing that the Senate is going to ratify that treaty by the necessary 2/3 majority vote. So it looks like Tyler's plan is working brilliantly. But then fate steps in. So Tyler and his cabinet go to the Hudson River, get on a U.S. warship, the Princeton, to watch the test firing of a new naval cannon. and everything goes wrong. The cannon explodes, several cabinet members are killed, Tyler's almost killed, and one of the fatalities is his Secretary of State, a man named Abel Upshur, the guy who had shepherded through the Treaty of Annexation with Texas. So Upshur's dead, and that means that you need a new Secretary of State to sort of finish the work, get this thing through the Senate. And the man that Tyler selects to be his new Secretary of State is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, old and crusty now, the guy who had fought with Andrew Jackson over the tariff and nullification, and the man who had written the positive good theory of slavery. Well, Calhoun is competent. He goes to work, gets the treaty finished, gets it in front of the Senate, and it looks like the thing is going to pass, no questions asked. And Calhoun's very proud of that. And he can't help but do a little bit of bragging, and the bragging he does is in the form of a letter to the British ambassador to the United States, and essentially the letter says, "Ha, Britain, you thought you were going to get Texas, but you're not. We're going to get Texas. We've won. You've lost again. You're not going to get Texas. And the reason that you wanted Texas, we know, was to stop the spread of slavery. Britain had at one time been engaged in the slave trade, and it had outlawed it, and then it had outlawed slavery in the entire British Empire. The British Navy was the most diligent force in the world trying to stop illegal smuggling of slaves on the high seas, and so Britain was perceived to be anti-slavery. Britain was anti-slavery, and it was wanting to get Texas to stop the spread of slavery, but now the U.S. is getting Texas, Calhoun says, and that means slavery is going to spread. Slavery is going to spread. Slavery is not only going to spread, it's going to put down deep, permanent roots in Texas, just like it's put down deep, permanent roots east of the Mississippi, and it's never going to die. It's never going to go away. Well, the British ambassador didn't appreciate that letter. They gave it to the papers. The papers published it. And Northern Whigs in the Senate who had woke up one morning prepared to vote for the treaty annexing Texas, believing that it was a way to drain slavery out of the United States, now saw that they had been lied to, that the perception of the administration, according to its own Secretary of State, was that annexing Texas would lead to the permanent installation of slavery, not only in Texas, but east of the Mississippi as well. And there was a giant political uproar, and as a consequence, the Treaty of Annexation failed. And when the Treaty of Annexation failed, John Tyler's premise for remaining president of the United States died with it. There was nothing for him to hang his hat on. He didn't have manifest destiny, because manifest destiny could only mean annexing Texas. And so Tyler's dreams of 4 more years as chief executive go out the window. And what does that mean? It means that we reduce ourselves now to a kind of old-fashioned election. We're going to have the Whigs contest the Democrats. Tyler is not going to be on the ticket, and as a consequence of that, we have to have candidates, right? And finally, the Whigs nominate the true spiritual leader of their party, which is Henry Clay. So Henry Clay is nominated by the Whigs. The Democrats leaned initially toward nominating Martin Van Buren, and although Van Buren had badly lost the electoral vote in the election of 1840, he had actually won the popular vote. And so, poor Martin, he didn't get a fair shake. That depression wasn't his fault. Let's go ahead and renominate the guy. Now, today you wouldn't do that. If you won for the presidency and you lose, in the modern era, they stamp a great big L on your forehead for loser, and politically you're done. You can attempt to get your party's nomination and fail and come back and try again. But if you actually get the nomination and run and you lose, you're politically washed up. But that wasn't the case in the 19th century. And so Van Buren looked like the guy who was going to be the Democratic nominee. So it looked like we were going to have Clay versus Van Buren. And although these were political rivals, they are men from an earlier era in American politics, and the last thing that they want to do is to have this great big national debate over manifest destiny, over annexing Texas, over slavery. Hasn't the country had enough of that trouble already? And so Van Buren and Clay both come out and announce that if elected, they would not annex Texas. And so Clay and Van Buren both say, if I become president, we're not annexing Texas. For Henry Clay, that's fine. The Whig Party doesn't want to annex Texas. It doesn't want to add slave territory to the U.S. But for Van Buren, that doesn't work out so well because the Democratic Party does want to annex Texas. It does want to expand slavery. Remember that the Democratic Party is a national party. Most Americans are Democrats, but the majority of the members of the Democratic Party are Southerners, and Southerners want Texas. They want slavery expansion, both for economic as well as political reasons. And so when Van Buren says, I want to annex Texas, unacceptable. And he is out. And instead, the Whigs nominate an Andrew Jackson protege named James K. Polk from Tennessee. And Polk is going to be the standard bearer of the Democratic Party in the election of 1844. And Polk embraces manifest destiny, but he embraces it in a very shrewd way because he argues not just for annexing Texas, but also for annexing the Oregon country. So we're going to annex Texas for the South. And then for the North, we're going to annex the Oregon country. Now, remember what the Oregon country is. It is essentially today's Washington and Oregon states, and then the west coast of Canada, all the way up to the southern border of Alaska, which is owned by the Russian Empire. And the U.S. and England had agreed in 1808 to jointly occupy the Oregon country, which was sparsely populated, the English mostly being in the north, engaged in the fur trade, the Americans mostly in the south, living as farmers. They had agreed to jointly occupy it until they figured out a way to divide it up. And now Polk says, we're not going to divide it up at all. I'm going to pursue manifest destiny in both Oregon and Texas. And in fact, he emphasizes the Oregon part of it, the part that would benefit the North, with his campaign slogan, which is 54, 40, or fight. 54 degrees, 40 minutes north, or fight. 54 degrees, 40 minutes north is the southern border of Alaska. So he's saying we will have all the Oregon territory, or we will have war with England to get it. And this message of national manifest destiny proves to be very popular. Something here for Northerners, something here for Southerners, and we get to have territorial expansion. We get to have manifest destiny, and once again, we're trying to stick it to the English. And Polk picks up momentum, and Clay notices it and begins to get nervous. This whole manifest destiny thing looks like the cudgel that is going to doom his best chance to be president of the United States, and that leads Clay to make a huge mistake, and a mistake that no serious politician running for the presidency should ever execute. He flip-flops. He waffles. He changes his stance on a key issue. So he comes out and he says, well, if I'm elected president, I would at least consider annexing Texas. He doesn't say he would. He's just saying, I'm not going to foreclose the possibility. I'll think about it. So it goes from absolutely not under no circumstances to, well, maybe. And whether or not he's just saying that to try and counteract the success that Polk is having with his proposal for national manifest destiny, 54, 40, or fight, it is a huge miscalculation because it's not going to win him any Democrats. Why would you flip over to Clay, who says he might annex Texas, when you can vote for Polk, who absolutely says he will annex Texas? So Clay wins no friends from the Democratic side. He converts no Polk voters to the Whig Party. What he does do is he angers a significant element of the Whig Party, and that is the abolitionist element. Now, it's relatively small, but this is going to be a close race, and so a relatively small number of people could make a huge difference, and as a consequence of Clay suddenly saying, well, I might add slave territory to the U.S., the abolitionists leave the Whig Party. They go out and they establish their own political party called the Liberty Party. And that has the effect, basically, of splitting the Whig vote in the election of 1844. So in the election of 1844, we have Polk the Democrat versus Clay the Whig, and then James Birney, who is running as the Liberty Party candidate. And the election is incredibly close. It's incredibly close. And it turns on just a handful of states. And it is in those states where you have the largest concentration of the abolitionists. And these abolitionists, 7,000 of them, vote for the Liberty Party. And those 7,000 votes spread over 3 states were just enough ballots to swing those states from Clay to Polk. And so in an incredibly tight election, Polk wins. And Clay has no one to blame but himself. If he hadn't changed his stance on annexing Texas, there would have been no Liberty Party. Those abolitionist votes would have been Whig votes, and they would have been enough to give those 3 critical states to Clay, and he would have won the Electoral College. Not the way that happens, and so Polk is elected to the presidency. The Democrats recapture control of the Congress, and even before Polk is sworn in, there is a treaty of annexation that is signed between Texas and the United States, and it is actually John Tyler who gets to sign that into law, so that when Polk comes into office, half of his promise has already been kept. Texas has been annexed to the Union. Texas has been annexed to the Union with the borders that Texas claims. So the Rio Grande is its southern border, and then all that territory in what is today New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado to boot. So Polk now has to keep his promise about Oregon, and it turns out that he doesn't. He does a lot of saber rattling, he does a lot of speech making, but at the end of the day, rather than have a war with England, which the U.S. really doesn't want to fight, and England doesn't really want to fight, he agrees to split the Oregon Territory in half along the 49th parallel. The 49th parallel being the modern border. So Polk accepts half of Oregon when he promised to take all of it or go to war against England, but he does manage to annex all of Texas. And one of the reasons that he's willing to cut the deal with Britain over Oregon is that the annexation of Texas has provoked war with Mexico. So when the U.S. annexed Texas, Mexico considered that to be an annexation of Mexican territory. And remember, Mexico has never accepted that Texas was independent. Texas was still part of Mexico. And even if Mexico was willing to allow Texas to be annexed, on Mexican maps, Texas was not nearly as big as what Texas claimed and what the U.S. had annexed. On Mexican maps, Texas stopped at San Antonio. So basically what today is central and southeast Texas is what Mexico perceived to be the rebellious province. Texas stopped at Corpus Christi on the Nueces, and from there you go up to San Antonio, and from there you head back and diagonal toward the border of Oklahoma. But that's not what the U.S. annexed, because that's not what Texas has said that it was. And so very quickly there was a dispute over what's called the Nueces Strip, that land between the Nueces River at Corpus Christi and the Rio Grande. And this was the bone of contention. And to assert American claims to that territory, President Polk sent a U.S. Army under the command of General Zachary Taylor to Corpus Christi, sort of rattled the American saber. The Mexicans sent an army up to Matamoros, and there was a standoff for many months while Polk tried diplomacy. And basically what he does is he sends negotiators down to Mexico, and they offer to buy this disputed territory for something along the lines of $11 million. And that's unacceptable. Mexico won't sell its territory. And so Polk decides to, sort of increase the tension, and he orders Zachary Taylor to take his army down to the Rio Grande. And so it marches overland, it sails by ship, it lands at Brazos Island, which is just south of South Padre Island, just north of the exit of the Rio Grande into the Gulf of Mexico, and Taylor establishes a supply point at Point Isabel, and he sends troops down to build a fort on the north bank of the Rio Grande, just to the northwest of Matamoros, and this is called Fort Texas. Mexico considered this as an invasion of its territory. On April 23rd of 1846, it declares war on the United States. So Mexico declares war on the United States. The Mexican army crosses the Rio Grande, ambushes, and almost wipes out an American cavalry patrol, lays siege to Fort Texas, and then it marches against Taylor's supply dump at Point Isabel. Taylor responds by leading his army against the Mexicans, and on April 8th, there is a major clash of arms at a place called Palo Alto. And although the American army is far smaller than the Mexican army, it is better trained, it is better led, it is better equipped, and it wins the battle fairly easily. The Mexicans retreat, make a stand the next day at a place called Resaca de la Palma. Taylor follows, and he attacks again, and once more he wins. The Mexican army is beaten even worse, and it is forced to flee across the Rio Grande and abandon its siege of Fort Texas. That had turned out to be a bloodless siege until the last day of the investment, at which point a Mexican artillery shell killed the commander at Fort Texas, Major Jacob Brown, and so the fort was renamed in his honor. It became known as Fort Brown, and the city that would eventually grow up in its shadow would become Brownsville, which of course it is still known as to this day. And this fighting along the Rio Grande took place before the American government even knew that Mexico had declared war. Polk was planning to ask Congress for a declaration of war in order to ensure that Texas got control, or rather that the U.S. got control of all the territory that Texas claimed. The problem with that was he wasn't sure he could win a vote to declare war, but Mexico's declaration of war, Mexico's attack on Taylor's army, simplified the problem enormously, because Polk could now go to the Congress of the American people and say, we have been attacked, our territory has been invaded, American blood has been shed, and that always works, and the Congress dutifully declared war on Mexico. The Mexican-American War that followed was dramatic. The numbers of troops engaged in it is relatively small compared to the American Civil War that's to come, but it's probably on a commensurate scale with what you saw in the War of 1812, and not far off the scale of the American Revolution. Initially, it was easy going for the Americans, and so Taylor marched his army into northern Mexico against the Mexican forces who were concentrated around the city of Monterrey. In September of 1846, in a three-day battle, he captured the city, forced the surrender of the Mexican army, which was disarmed and allowed to march home. At about the same time, columns of American troops were spreading across the Southwest. They captured Santa Fe. They gobbled up what would become Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. In California, where a lot of Americans had gone to settle, there was an uprising led by people like Charles Fremont and supported by U.S. warships and the Marine contingents off the coast. And this rebellion overthrew Mexican control of California. And although there will be some subsequent attempts at reversing that course, they will prove to be unsuccessful. And so by the time you get to the end of 1846, the United States has won everything it wishes to win in its war with Mexico. This is a war that started between two countries that were equal in size, equal in population, so it looked like it was going to be a fair fight. But the Americans were far better organized, equipped, led. The American government was much more efficient, and so there had been easy success. And President Polk was ready to end the war. The problem was Mexico wasn't. Mexico wasn't prepared to end the war. And that means that the U.S. is going to have to continue it. And that is going to increase the cost in terms of blood and treasure. And of course, it's going to increase the risk that this thing might yet turn out badly. And so the president was trying to figure out what to do. And at that point, enter back onto the stage General Santa Anna, who comes and goes in Mexican politics. Hero, villain, federalist, centralist, centralist, federalist. He's like a yo-yo. He's in and he's out. And at this current moment, he's in disfavor and exiled in Cuba. But he sees the war with the United States as an opportunity, so he gets a hold of President Polk, and he says, look, I know you want to make peace with Mexico, and the people running the Mexican government right now foolishly are not willing to do that. So here's my proposal. You give me the money you were willing to pay Mexico to get the Rio Grande border for Texas. You order your Navy, which is blockading Mexico, to look the other way. You let me get back to Mexico, and then I will use that money to pave the way for my return to the presidency. And once I'm president of Mexico, I will make peace with you, and we will end the war. And Polk says, well, that's a pretty good bargain. That's far less expensive than continuing the war and far more certain than continuing the war. So he makes the deal. Santa gets the money. The Navy looks the other way. Santa gets back to Mexico, gets back into the presidential palace in Mexico, and then he double-crosses Polk. No, he's going to use that money to refit the Mexican army and fulfill his promise to the people of Mexico to expel the Yankee invader from our soil. So the war is going to continue, and the Americans are going to have to find a way to win it. And of course, the way to win it is to capture Mexico City and force Mexico's surrender. That is not something that General Taylor's army is positioned to do, because it would have to march south through the deserts and mountains of central Mexico to get to the capital. There's no way logistically you can do that. So the decision is made to withdraw most of Taylor's veteran units, replace them with volunteers or green troops, assign those veteran units to another American army that is forming in New Orleans under the command of General Winfield Scott. And we remember Winfield Scott, one of the heroes of the War of 1812. He's at the prime of his military career now, and he is going to lead an amphibious invasion of Mexico off the Gulf Coast at the port of Veracruz, and then march overland against Mexico City. A dicey thing, to be sure, something that a lot of military professionals doubted could be done, but a better bet than a long overland march through deserts and mountains. Scott's going to get the job instead of Taylor, because Taylor's a Whig. Taylor's a Whig, and Polk has no desire to make Taylor any more famous as a military figure than he already is after Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma and Monterrey. So he's going to give the job of subduing Mexico City to Scott. And while Scott is mounting his amphibious expedition, Santa Anna knows that the clock is running against him, so he takes his newly resurrected Mexican army, he marches north, once again through the mountains and deserts where he's not supposed to go, to launch a surprise attack on General Taylor's army. And this provokes one of the biggest and most dramatic battles of the Mexican War on February 22nd of 1847 in the shadow of a majestic mountain called Buena Vista, which of course means beautiful view. The Mexican attack almost catches Taylor's army by surprise, but at the last moment Texas Rangers warn him that Santa Anna is coming, so Taylor's ready, and in a very tough fought battle, he manages to beat off the Mexican assault. And one of the key actions there is a counterattack by a regiment of Mississippi volunteers known as the Mississippi Rifles, led by Colonel Jefferson Davis, who will later play a very prominent role as president of the Confederate States during the American Civil War. And so the Americans win the Battle of Buena Vista. Ironically, that is going to make Taylor the great military hero that Polk had hoped he would not become. Not only has he won this big dramatic battle against long odds, he's won it in a majestic setting, and a battle that was fought on George Washington's birthday to boot. And remember, George Washington's birthday is still a significant national holiday. Militarily, however, this has benefited the United States because it clears the way for Scott to make his amphibious assault at Veracruz. And so the U.S. Navy paves the way, the American troops land, they surround Veracruz, and they shell it into surrender. Santa Anna has to retreat from in front of Taylor and try and get between Scott and Mexico City, which he does. And now Scott has to make this long overland advance against Mexico City. And this is going to be difficult because he's got to have a supply line that connects him to Veracruz. He's got to march through mountains. The passes in those mountains are very easily defended. It looks like an impossible errand, but Scott manages to do it. And he manages to do it for a couple of reasons. First off, Texas Rangers, who, of course, have no love for Mexicans, and Mexicans have no love for Texans. Texas Rangers managed to keep guerrillas from disrupting Scott's supply line. So Scott's army is able to make its march on Mexico City. Once again, the American army is better led, better equipped, better trained, better armed than its Mexican counterparts. And although the Mexican army under Santa Anna is defending mountain passes, Scott's smart enough not to make frontal attacks into those mountain passes. Instead, he finds a way to outflank them. And here he has a young officer on his staff, a Virginian by the name of Robert E. Lee, who's an engineer who conducts a series of very risky personal reconnaissance missions that continually find these unexpected ways for the Americans to outflank the Mexican army. This is the beginning of Lee's ascent up the American military ladder to great prominence. And this enables the Americans to beat the Mexicans again and again on the road to Mexico City. And finally, in mid-September of 1847, American troops under Scott storm the defenses of Mexico City. They break through them in the course of just a day or two, and Mexico City falls to the conquering Americans. The Mexican government collapses, Santa Anna flees once more into exile, and the U.S. has essentially won the war. It will take until February of 1848 before a treaty will actually be written and signed. That treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, ends the Mexican War and grants the United States all of that territory he had conquered in 1846. So you get the Rio Grande border of Texas, you get California, and you get the rest of the Spanish Southwest, what today would be Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, a good chunk of Colorado, and even some pieces of Wyoming. It adds 20% to the territory of the United States, and it cuts Mexico in half. It cuts Mexico in half. None of this, of course, is going to happen without consequences. Polk had promised to serve only one term when he was elected. He's going to keep that promise, so he's going to exit the stage not long after the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo is signed. The next year, he's going to die of tuberculosis, so he's not around to see the consequences of what he had managed to accomplish. And those consequences are going to be the reopening of the question of slavery in new territories. It wasn't a question of slavery in Texas. Slavery was already there. But are we going to allow slavery, and with it Southern economic and political power, to flow into the rest of the Mexican cession? Are we going to allow it to flow into California? And so that debate that we thought we'd put to bed in Missouri and reburied in the nullification crisis, that debate over economics and politics wrapped up with the institution of slavery, is going to be resurrected as a consequence of the war with Mexico. And so we end our lecture here. When we pick up after this, we will begin to look at the events of the 1850s that are going to propel the United States towards the secession crisis and Civil War. But for the moment, we have some questions that you need to answer and email back in to me. So 5 questions. Question number 1, what political candidates' change of heart on the question of annexing Texas cost him the presidency in 1844? What political candidates' change of heart over the question of annexing Texas cost him the presidency in 1844? Question number 2, true or false, William Henry Harrison was the first American president to die in office? True or false? William Henry Harrison was the first American president to die in office. Question number 3. Name of the political party formed by radical abolitionists in opposition to the annexation of Texas. Name of the political party formed by the radical abolitionists in opposition to the annexation of Texas. Question number 4. What was the political slogan used by the Whigs to elect William Henry Harrison to the presidency in 1840? What was the political slogan used by the Whigs to get William Henry Harrison elected to the presidency in 1840? And the 5th and final question, the commander of the American Army that captured Mexico City. What is the name of the commander of the American Army that captured Mexico City? So answer those questions for me, email them in. They will, of course, be part of the objective portion of your quiz, and look for the next lecture to be posted within the week as we move the United States ever closer to secession and civil war.